Alright guys, well welcome to my overview and review of the ATOMRC Penguin. We'll start off the bat with the build and setup. I purchased the plug-and-play setup because the kit wasn't available. While I've been generally satisfied with the motors, one did just fail on me in flight. Fortunately no damages were sustained, but I'll be switching to the iFlight Xing 2205-2300 kV motor. I feel like this will match the stock motor in terms of overall performance, at least pretty closely, and I was quite happy with how it was flying. I'm not always a fan of plug-and-play setups, though this one does seem to be overall okay. I also have a ATOMRC Whale, which had a ESC failure that wasn't from abuse or anything like that. So always a little bit cautious of these plug-and-play setups, and once again, it's kind of proved why I typically try to buy kits and set up with my own equipment. I can barely remember a time when I lost a motor or ESC on an airplane that wasn't from a plug-and-play setup. The overall build was straightforward. The wings are detachable, but that doesn't drastically reduce the size. I decided to 3D print a nose out of TPU because I had concerns that the ATOMRC nose that they have set up to be able to handle digital video transmitters wasn't going to be very durable, so I printed mine out of TPU. It took me a few times to get it the way I wanted. The O3 is very likely to overheat if it doesn't get enough airflow. And as you've seen from my previous videos, the Penguin can slow down to a crawl. And when you're doing that, you're not getting a lot of airflow over the O3 video transmitter. And so that was leading to overheating issues. But after a few trial prints and testing things out, I seem to have got it working right. The airplane has these bays on the side, which are perfect for your RX and your GPS. A large bay in the center, I ended up putting my Matek F722-WPX in just because that's what I had on hand. One complaint I had was while the wing servos are fairly lengthy, maybe even too lengthy, the elevator servo was really short, and obviously the ATOMRC flight controller must have the PWM plugs in the back. You could have shoved the flight controller further back, but I would have had to shove it really far back, and it wasn't how I wanted to set it up, so I ended up just having to use an extension for that servo cable. I'm not sure why they chose to make that one so short. Battery bay has these markings for positioning, which makes it easy to swap and adjust for different batteries. I'm generally sticking with a 4S LiPo between 1500 and 2200 milliamp hours, though I've also flown it with a Li-ion battery as well, which it can handle just fine. Now onto the iNav setup. I'm not going to cover too much on here because there's lots of guides on setting up your plane in iNav, but one thing I want to touch about, which is important for flying the Penguin, is the need for differential throttle. That's done in the mixer. You can see I've set mine up to provide quite a bit of differential throttle, and you can adjust that by changing the yaw value here. Next crucial bit is going to be in your PID setup, your tuning setup, and that's the yaw value. The PID value should be zeroed with only the feed forward active. There's a lot of videos that touch on this, but iNav doesn't really do yaw stabilization correctly for an airplane. It attempts to do yaw stabilization like you would see in a quad, except in certain flight modes where it does kind of an estimation to speed and attempts to do the correct yaw for that based on like pre-calculated bank. I'm not going to cover it in detail here, but as far as I'm concerned, you do not want yaw stabilization to be affecting what the motors are going to be doing. You want to make sure that you test this on the bench, remove your props, and just practice using the yaw control and see if the right motor speeds up. If you put your stick to the right, the left motor should speed up, and you put your stick to the left, of course the right motor should speed up. You want to make sure you test that, and if you ever disconnect the motors for whatever reason, make sure that you plug them back into the correct spot 1 and 2. Otherwise, you're going to have a bit of a headache when you get in the air and attempt to use the yaw control. One thing I don't like about the design, you can see here the hatches, they use a screw mount. Now, that on its own, I don't have a problem with. I actually kind of like that. It feels more secure than magnets. Here you can see I've added a mount for the Insta360 Go camera and the Go 2 or the Caddx Peanut, and it's great that there's a screw holding it down. It's not just magnets, because that is always a little bit of a worry with magnets. But as you see, there's nothing holding the screw in, and that's really easy to lose in the field. It falls out very simply, and you know, all of a sudden you'll be in the field with no screw. And I don't know if they included any extras. I'm sure it's not that hard to get, but bit of a pain. So I would have preferred that they have something to help hold that screw from getting too far out. And there are some things you can do to do that so that the screw doesn't want to fall out. And so I might play around with trying to find something for that, because I could just see myself losing one of these screws out in the field and then having to tape the hatches on. As far as flying goes, the Penguin is a great little plane. It's quite maneuverable, but of course what everyone wants to know about is this crazy high alpha you might have seen me doing in my last couple videos on the plane. Sometimes this maneuver is called a Harrier. You commonly see this done by 3D airplanes, and those are, you know, the aerobatic airplanes that you might see out at a club. So to do this maneuver, we're going to fly the airplane around. We're in a state where the nose is pointed quite far up, and the wings are partially or mostly stalled. If you've ever seen what the coefficient of lift diagram looks like, we're kind of existing in this state where we're past what would be considered the stall, at least as I understand it based on the AOA of the aircraft. So the wing is stalled, but just because the wing is stalled doesn't mean it's not creating any lift. It's just creating less lift than at lower angles of attack. And then to fly, what we're doing is we're balancing on that remaining lift as well as the thrust from the motors. This isn't something that most airplanes can do. Most FPV airplanes that I've operated could not do this, or at least not to this level. So if you wanted to try this, it's important to make sure that you have full throttles on the elevator. I've heard some reviewers are recommending reducing it for normal flying, but personally I love this airplane with a lot of throw, and not just for high alpha. Watch how hard and crisp it can maneuver by doing things like pitching over after this vertical climb. So for high alpha, we need to do the following things. I would recommend turning off auto level or continuous servo trim. Fly it once with it on, fly at normal, straight and level in normal airspeed, and then land, save, and turn that feature off. I think that there's a chance that it could give you a little bit of a headache if the plane is trying to trim itself when it's in such a weird situation. Have a differential throttle on and tested, obviously, make sure it works. I recommend using a mount that you can pitch your camera down slightly. My mount allows for about a 10 degrees nose down pitch, and I'll have a link to that below. Then here's a key. You want to set your FPV camera to 4:3 aspect ratio instead of 16:9. And of course, if you have a wide angle lens, or you have a camera that has a wide angle lens like the DJI O3, that's going to help it a lot. So why is the 4:3 important? Well, most camera sensors are 4:3, and when you set it to 16:9, all you're doing is telling the display to chop off the top and bottom. So if you go to 4:3 from 16:9, see how much more you can see. So with the DJI O3 and a 4:3 setup like this, I can actually see incredibly far nose down at about a 10 degrees of physical pitch down on the camera itself, and even when the nose is pointed pretty close to straight up, I actually do have a horizon that I can use to judge my height and what the aircraft's doing. So if you're just starting off with this, you might want to try it first in angle mode if you've never played around with this kind of Harrier high alpha maneuver before. All you have to do is let the plane slow down and move your pitch slowly to the full nose up position. Now you're controlling pitch and altitude with your throttle. Same thing with steering. You steer with the yaw, which in this case is our asymmetric thrust. The advantage of angle mode is that the plane will more or less lock at 45-degree angle nose up, and it'll hold the wings level, and you don't have to worry about it pitching over too far. And so it'll just kind of hold itself there to the best of its ability. You'll notice with the throttle, you can kind of govern it. With not enough throttle, the nose will want to come down, but with too much throttle, the plane will climb, but it'll only climb with a nose up degree about 45 degrees. It also will fairly smoothly accelerate out of angle mode. It doesn't get too crazy. But once you're comfortable, you might want to try it in acro. In acro, you need to be a lot more sensitive on your controls. The pitch and the throttle have to kind of work in balance with each other. But you have a lot more control. You can really get that nose up farther. This is where that 4:3 aspect and the wide camera angle are so important, so you can see what you're doing. O3 works great for this. But an alternative I thought of would be setting up a servo to pitch the FPV camera up and down. I've seen that done before on other types of setups. Be really careful when you accelerate out of this, because what's happening is the acro mode is trying to pitch you up based on, you know, where your stick position is, and it can't do it because you don't have enough throttle on. It doesn't have the yaw, or it doesn't have the pitch authority to do so. So what's happening is the I-term error is accumulating, and now thankfully this is one of the cases where iNav's limit on I-term error correction will help you a little bit. But if you just suddenly give it a lot of throttle, the plane is going to want to keep pitching up all the way until it's now almost on its back. So you need to be ready on the controls for that. And again, it's where it's important having that wide angle view so you get that clear sense of what the airplane is doing. But when you're hovering around like this, your yaw is still how you're going to do the majority of your steering. You can use small later on inputs, but be really careful since we're mostly flying around in this very stalled state. And small bank angles will have a big effect on how much lift is actually being created by those wings. But done right, this plane can be accurately controlled at ridiculously slow speeds through different obstacles and gaps. You can try this in manual as well, but without acro to keep the plane's roll axis stable, you'll find that it probably wants to rock quite a bit, or rock back and forth, and that can make it a little bit tricky to actually fly it, and doesn't feel as nice. Once you accelerate out into the normal speed regimen, this plane is very stable. I've heard it talked about as being the stable T1. And personally, I actually always thought the T1 was a decently stable airplane for its size, but I will admit this airplane does seem to be that much more stable. And even though the airfoil is quite thick and the overall shape and planform of the aircraft is not really meant for speed, it can get up there to speed without too much trouble. 2 motors creates a lot of thrust and can overcome that drag. Grant you, it's not that efficient at those speeds, but it can in fact do them. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. I'm really liking this airplane, and if you have one or are looking to get one, I hope this video helped you out with just getting some of the stuff about the plane figured out. And if you want to try the high alpha maneuvers, I think it's a really neat addition to kind of normal FPV flying.